Welcome to episode 9 of Waypoint Connect, and it's so great for us that Alice Vosloo is able to join us this morning. Alice, welcome and thank you much for your time and spending this 20 minutes with us this afternoon.
Thanks, Dirk. It's a pleasure.
Alice, maybe you want to start it off and just give an overview of who you are, where you're from, so that people just can get to know you a bit better.
Yes, I'm Alice and I'm 36 years old, originally from PE. I stayed in PE until I was 23 years old, and then moved to Joburg when I got my first double lung transplant. I was born with cystic fibrosis, which was the reason for the first lung transplant. And then 10 years after the first transplant, I became the first person in SA to have a successful second double lung transplant. And today is actually 3 years, 5 months after my second transplant. So yeah, all in all, it's about 13 and a half years now that I've been given, a new life, thanks to two awesome organ donors that, I'll never know.
Yeah, awesome. Alice, what is cystic fibrosis? And to be honest, when we engaged in conversation, it forced me to read up a bit more about it. So for people that have tuned in that are not familiar with CF, as you say, people also refer to it, what is cystic fibrosis all about?
So it's a genetic disease. It affects, well, it's actually one of the most common genetic diseases. And what it does is it mostly affects your pancreas and lungs. Some people have some liver involvement as well, but it's not that common. So the problem is that your body produces quite a thick mucus, and the problem that causes in your lungs is it's like a trap for bacteria. So you would get a lot of lung infections, and that causes scarring, and you would get more lung infections. You become resistant to antibiotics, so they don't work anymore. So you end up being on IV antibiotics quite a lot, on multiple antibiotics to try and kill the bugs that have colonized in your lungs. And eventually you just lose so much lung function that you can't function anymore. So for me, that was at the age of about 21, 22, when my lungs were just so badly scarred and full of infection that I couldn't function anymore.
And Alice, with it being a genetic disorder, when were you diagnosed with CF for the first time?
I was diagnosed at age 2, which I think was a relief for my parents, because before then they didn't actually know what was wrong with me. When you're born, it's not much lung involvement yet, because your lungs are still new, but the problem is you don't gain weight as you should because of the pancreatic involvement. So you've got stomach pain the whole time and you're not gaining weight like you should. So it gets misdiagnosed a lot as just being a difficult baby or colic or whatever. But then luckily my grandmother actually heard a radio program about cystic fibrosis, and she told my mom to have me tested because she said it sounded like me. And then we did have me tested for CF, and it was the problem.
Now, at 2 years old, that wouldn't have impacted you at that moment, but it must have had an impact on your parents. So first off, it was relief because they knew now what was causing their concern for you not gaining weight, because I know as parents, that's like the big marker for you, is your baby healthy. But then how did they deal with the prognosis? Because what is the prognosis for CF?
So it's if you get born now in 2021, it's the prognosis is not as bad. But back in 1984, the prognosis really wasn't good. And the doctors told my parents that there's not a big chance of me reaching the age of 20. at all. So it was quite a bleak prognosis. And I think what complicated it as well is at that point when I was diagnosed, my mom was actually pregnant with my sister.
Sure.
So now they knew my sister could possibly also have this disease. And yes, I think it must have been an extremely stressful time for them, but clearly they handled it well in the end, and they didn't raise me like a sick child. And obviously they were very cautious about me staying healthy, but in terms of the way that they prepared me for life, they didn't give me the idea that I'm going to have a shorter lifespan. So they instilled the same ambitions in me as my sister, and she luckily then turned out not to have CF. So yeah, it was only me in the end, and I would say they pretty much raised us the same.
Yeah, and just for our listeners' sake, with CF being a recessive gene, both parents need to have that gene in order for the child to have it. So when a child is born, they've got a 25% chance of actually having CF, a 50% chance of being a carrier but being perfectly healthy, and then a 50% chance of not having that recessive gene at all and being healthy.
Yes.
Obviously, for your sister, actually the odds were in her favor at 75% of actually not having CF.
Yes, and she's actually not a carrier of the gene either. So
yeah, so she actually slotted in that 25%, which is
yeah, so I'm the 25% and she's the other 25%.
Yeah. Now, for young people, and I can't say we think because I'm not in that age bracket anymore, but for young people, and if I think back when I was growing up, you don't think of old as being old. You think old is 30 and 40. And simply because you're not focused on my life is going to finish, because we see ourselves reaching the age of 70 and 80. So it's a topic that's definitely not at the forefront of our minds. And I think that's a leading cause for all the silly things young people get up to, myself included. But for you, when you got to the age of, you said, if I remember correctly, around about 22, when your lungs really started failing. For you at 22 and your average young person at 22, it's a completely different reference at that point in terms of where my life is at. How did you deal with that whole process of, now my lungs are failing and the end is not somewhere over there, it's actually possibly coming up now? How did you deal with that?
So that was very difficult. I remember, especially when I was about 22, then I was finished with my 3-year varsity degree. So I almost had nothing to do because I was too sick to continue studying and I was too sick to start working. Whereas my friends were, dating people and they were starting their adult lives, they were starting jobs. Some of them were moving away from PE. And I was just stuck in the house literally because I was on oxygen. So I could barely go out of the house. And if I did, I had to have portable oxygen with me, which has a battery life of about 2 hours. So, everything is very stressful when you do leave home. So it was a very stressful time. I would definitely say my friends and family helped a lot. I mean, when I was at a point where I couldn't really leave the home easily, I had a lot of friends who could have spent their Friday nights, partying, but they chose to come to my place and play board games. So I was very lucky with a brilliant support system. And I think the thing that kept me going was just the possibility of getting new lungs and also being normal. I had a quote, typical, or what do you call it, press sticks on top of my desk that said something like, it's the possibility of a dream coming true that makes life interesting. And that kind of always kept me going because I used to imagine getting new lungs and coming back down to PE and being able to breathe and just, being able to be normal, and, how much I would enjoy doing things that I haven't been able to do for ages, like swim in the sea, etc. So I think it was hope that kept me going. And also I spend a lot of time actually on YouTube looking at stories of positive transplants that have happened, seeing people mostly in the States who've had cystic fibrosis, who had a transplant and who are doing great. And I think seeing those positive stories also helped me prepare for the actual surgery, but also helped me to just, keep hope alive.
That's awesome. And I think it's so important what you're highlighting, the fact that you need a strong support group. Secondly, even though it's your third point that you related to, that you focus on the positives, not focus on the negatives. And then I think the most important thing is just having that hope. And I think for whatever situation you're facing, if you get at that point where you lose hope, that's when the end has come. So in a sense, that's in your hands when the end is going to come, because when you lose hope, that's when the end is there. Alice, and when you got that call that they've got a donor for you, what went through your mind? What happened?
It was an undescribable moment, and I'm actually getting goosebumps right now because I remember it so clearly. It was on a Monday night, and I actually had a really terrible day, and I went for a cocktail actually with one of my friends, with my oxygen and everything. I just decided this day was so bad, I need to just do something nice. And I still remember going out to like a cocktail bar that was in Mood, and we went for a cocktail, and I got home and I couldn't sleep, and my phone was on silent. And I remember, rolling around, tossing and turning, and my phone started vibrating. And I looked and I saw on the screen that it was the transplant coordinator from Joburg calling. So I answered, and, she was first making a little bit of small talk, like asking, how am I doing? Also, obviously, trying to find out how my health is, because if you've got an active infection and you're really sick, they can't actually give you a transplant because you won't survive the surgery. So, she was asking, how am I doing? And I said, no, I'm okay, but obviously I knew she's calling for a reason. Like, you're not going to call me just before midnight for nothing. And my heart was just racing so badly. And she said to me, they've got a potential donor for me, because things might not work out, but they've got a potential donor. And when is the soonest that I can be in Joburg? So I said, well, look, PE airport closes at, it's probably closed already by that time, 11 o'clock at night, but, I can get on the first flight in the morning. And then she said, that's fine. I need to make plans to be on the first morning flight, and keep her updated. And then she asked me, do I need to call my parents, or, was she going to call them, or must I wake them up? So I said, no, it's fine, I'll wake them up. But yes, it was a blur, and my mom and I were both shaking so much. We were like complete idiots with trying to book plane tickets. And eventually my sister woke up, and we'd even forgotten to let her know that they've called me. She was still sleeping, and she came downstairs and she was like, what are you guys doing? And we were just like in a tiz and saying, like, please help us book flights. So she took over and we booked flights to Joburg first thing in the morning. So yes, obviously didn't sleep that night. Literally just, took a bath, packed some stuff, did some of my nebulizing treatments to try and open my lungs up a bit for the flight. So yes, just stressed, calling people, tried calling my friends, but they're all sleeping. Eventually one of them, answered the phone. So yeah, it was amazing and very exciting. And at the same time, you also do feel a bit sad because someone has obviously passed away, because there's a potential donor. So on the one side, one family is grieving right now, and they've lost their child or mother, So yeah, it's bittersweet, but it was very exciting because I knew there's like light at the end of the tunnel. You know, something might happen now that will change my life forever.
Yeah, and I just want to check, did you go to Mole Park for your transplant?
Yes.
Yeah, because that's currently the only unit that's able to do a transplant of this extent.
They
And
actually now they've started in Cape Town as well.
hmm,
So for the last 2 years or so, they've also been doing it at Groote Schuur Hospital in Cape Town. But before then, and definitely in 2008, Moorpark was the only option.
and just to give context to what we're talking about, for South Africa in 2016, only 450 cases were reported of people with CF, and when I chatted to you, you said currently it's probably around about 550, just over 500, maybe even 600 for South Africa, compared to the US, where you have 10,000 people living with CF. And like you said earlier, that's why a lot of what you were focused on was people in the US going through this kind of procedure. And for lung transplants, from 2000 to 2016, they only did 89 transplants, double lung transplants and lung transplants. And it's actually quite a complicated operation because of the size of the organ, the complexity of that. And that's part of why we see such low numbers. And then combined with that in South Africa, where our donor base is very small. So,
Mm.
and for me, what you touched on is exactly that fragility, that fragile state of life where one family is going through the loss of a family member and trying to deal with that, where for your family it was what we've been hoping for is now real, and it's a second chance at life, which is amazing. And so you guys were having completely different emotions, and for you also at that point, just that awareness of somebody offered something up for me. And I think for a family grieving, that's part of the hope that there is within that we've lost a family member, but they made life possible for somebody else, which I think is such an amazing gift to give somebody else.
Yes, no, absolutely.
And Alice, for you, how did life then change after the transplant? Because surely
Um,
it couldn't have been the same.
yes, no, it's like chalk and cheese. I mean, before transplant, my day consisted of waking up in a coughing fit, because overnight a lot of mucus had built up in my lungs again. So it was about spending about 2 hours trying to clear your lungs a little bit. So nebulizing, doing some chest physio, doing all sorts of nebulizers, different ones, antibiotic ones, ones to open up your lungs, etc. And then eating, with all that coughing and breathing treatments, you actually burn so much calories. You're normally quite underweight. So eating is a very important part of the day. Getting professional physio 3 times a week, sleeping a little bit in between, trying to cope with studies if you're able to. So yes, it was just the I would say 80% of your day went into trying to stay alive, literally. And afterwards, I mean, the first thing I noticed in ICU when I woke up was how quiet the room was, because my old lungs were so damaged. When I was lying in bed breathing, it sounded a little bit like a Pick and Pay bag or something being scrunched up,
Sure.
like the wheezing noises it made. And then in ICU, when I woke up, it was dead quiet, apart from the hospital machines, but the breathing was quiet. And that was to me like a big moment when I realized like my breathing is not making a noise anymore. So afterwards, the recovery, I had a really, really smooth recovery. I was in hospital for 2 weeks in total, went home, and then most of it was actually building up muscle strength again, because my body had become weak. So it was walking and just getting some endurance going. And then after I was fully recovered at say 2 to 3 months after the surgery, my life was pretty much like a normal person's. The only difference is I just have to take a handful of pills twice a day. But I mean, compared to spending 80% of your day trying to stay alive, drinking pills twice a day at 9 o'clock and 9 o'clock is nothing. So, I was able to actually, look for a job, find work, which I did. And yes, just becoming independent, earning a salary, going on my own medical aid, meeting new people, dating, just normal things. So it's completely different. I mean, I often said it's not even a second chance at life. It's actually like a first chance.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And it just highlights again that on the one hand, the little things we take for granted, like anybody that's healthy. And in my own life, when I've got the man flu, and I feel really sorry for myself. I'm like, man, if I could just feel better, it would be so awesome. And then you get there, and it's like a week later, and you've forgotten the fact that you're healthy and you don't have this body ache all over. So
Yes.
for me, it's like one of the topics is we take the small things like our health, which is a huge thing, for granted. We just expect the fact that we're supposed to be healthy. And
Yes.
for you, going through that, managing this condition, and then suddenly you're in a different space, like you said, it's like starting life for the first time. So
Yes.
it just highlights for me the fact again, not to take life for granted and not to take the small things for granted, but then linking in with what you're sharing as well is don't live your life as if you've got 20 or 50 more years of life left. If I do quick calculations, 200, 300 Mondays left. Don't begrudge this Monday because you wanted the weekend to be longer. Just like grab this Monday.
Yes.
You don't know how many Mondays you've got left. Make the best out of this Monday that you've got.
No, that's super true.
And for you, that because to have that double lung transplant and then be in a position again where you have to go through that process and eventually getting another donor, and now you are just over 3 years after that second procedure. How does that change your outlook on where you are now?
I mean, like you said, when you recover from the flu, you almost forget what it felt like. And I mean, even though I was sick for, so long, a few years after you breathing normally, you do kind of forget what it felt like to struggle. Like you remember, but you also don't remember, if that makes sense.
Yep.
And I wouldn't say you start taking things for granted, because I've never taken good health for granted ever. So I wouldn't say that, but you do maybe start complaining about little things a little bit, like traffic or load shedding, normal things, which is probably part of a normal life. But then when my first transplant started rejecting and I gradually started struggling to breathe again, all of those feelings came rushing back, how it felt like the first time around. And it was also a lot of uncertainty, because at that point they'd never given someone a second transplant. So I wasn't sure if that would be an option for me. Was I facing death now, or is there still hope? So it was quite a difficult process, and I was very lucky that the rejection that I had was quite stable. It was a very slow rejection, so it gave the doctors time to think about it and to consider their options, and eventually they decided they would try and give me a second transplant, which was great news. And then when I got a second transplant, I mean, it's like even more gratefulness from my side than after the first one, because now it's not only like the fact that one donor has saved my life, it's now a second family that has saved my life. It's doctors who were willing to take a risk, and going out on a limb and trying something they've never tried. So it was a lot of gratefulness the second time. And especially, you know, because they'd never done it before, really, they couldn't tell me how the recovery is going to be. And you know, they kind of prepared me for a much more difficult recovery the second time around, because there's scar tissue and, you know, all of that. But it actually wasn't. You know, I was again just in ICU for a week afterwards. And I was in the general ward for a little bit longer than after the first time. But recovery was actually a bit easier after the second transplant. And that was another miracle for me. You know, I was expecting the worst, and then it was actually not that bad. And then before I knew it, I felt great again, you know, like I did in the first 7 or 8 years after my initial transplant. So yes, definitely not taking anything for granted. And day to day, I do appreciate small things like waking up and being able to lie on my back. Like I could never lie on my back because it would feel like I'm drowning with all the mucus that I've built up in the night. So waking up, having a clear chest, you know, being able to lie on my back, being able to sleep late because you're not coughing yourself awake every morning early. That's amazing, and that's a miracle by itself. So definitely take small things for granted. If I see a set of stairs, you know, I don't need to have a panic attack. I can just climb them out. You know, I don't need to look for a lift or make an excuse that I can't go up the stairs, etc. So everything is just so much easier, and I think it gives you perspective. So when you do have problems, you know, normal life problems, then at least you can be like, in the big scheme of things, it's not really important, you know. If you can breathe, then everything else can be sorted out.
Yeah. Alice, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you for being open and honest with us this morning, sharing your experiences, because I think a lot of people, especially with what we're going through with COVID, lockdown, job losses because of that, people need to hear a message of hope, and this definitely is a message of hope. And just a reminder of, yes, that area of my life could be horribly going wrong at this moment, but I've got a lot of other things that are great, that are blessings that I've received, that are gifts, and it's not all bad. So
Definitely
get a different perspective, have that hope that's there, don't lose the hope, and value the small things. And while we have people in relationships, acknowledge people, build people up, because we don't know how much time we've got or they've got.
no, that's so true.
So Alice, thank you very much. Hope you have a great week, and thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it, and it was great talking to you.
Yes, thanks for chatting, and have a good week as well.
Thanks a lot.